Hello everyone, welcome back to e-learning. So we're on Natural Sciences Term 1 and our topic is reproduction of plants. Now reproduction is one of the 7 life processes of living organisms. It is necessary for a species to produce a new organism. Sexual reproduction prevents a species from becoming extinct. You get a male and a female parent and specialized cells for reproduction to occur. A male sex cell is called a sperm and a female sex cell is called an ovum. When a sperm and an ovum fuse together, that means they join together, fertilization occurs. Now, fertilization results in a new cell, and this is called the zygote, which will later become an embryo. And this grows into a new organism that has similar characteristics to their parent. Now, we get diversity within the plant kingdom, and it is divided into two groups. Now, plants can either grow or reproduce by seeds, or they reproduce by spores. Now, seeds bearing plants are further divided into flowering and non flowering plants. Ferns and mosses reproduce by spores. Seed bearing plants uh, has a reproductive structure that contains an embryo, stored nutrients, and a seed. The seed will germinate if conditions are ideal and they will develop into a new plant. Now, the plants with seeds are divided into gymnosperms and angiosperms. Remember that you need to know the structure of a flower. Now, you need to know each and every part of the flower and the function of it for your exam. We're going to look at angiosperms. Angiosperms are flowers in plants that form the largest group in the plant kingdom. The flower is the reproductive structure of an angiosperm. It has both the male and the female part. The male part produces pollen, while the female part produces ovules. Once fertilization has occurred, the ovules develop into seeds. Angiosperms are further classified into monocotyledonous and dicotyledonous plants. And examples of these are lilies, proteas, blackjacks, daisies, and even peas. Now let's look at gymnosperms. Gymno basically means naked and sperm means seeds. So they are naked seeds. That means they are not enclosed by an ovary. They do not produce flowers. The cone is a reproductive structure of the gymnosperm. We have male cones that produce pollen, while the male sex cells fertilize the eggs in the ovules in a female cone. The pollen is normally carried by wind to the female cone, and examples of these are pine trees, cycads, and yellowwood trees. Now let's look at monocotyledonous and dicotyledonous plants. If you look at the picture, monocotyledonous means that they have one seed, while dicotyledonous, you can see that there are two seeds. Okay, now the cotyledonous is a part of the seed that provides nutrients to the embryo. Now, monocotyledonous plants produces seeds that has one cotyledon, and dicotyledonous it has two. Di means two. Okay. Now, this is quite important. You need to know the differences between a monocotyledonous plant and a dicotyledonous plant. We're going to look at an example of a monocotyledonous being a maize and a dicotyledonous being a bean seed. Now, remember, monocot is one cotyledonous and dicot means two. The root system of a monocotyledonous, it has a fibrous root system. So there's no main root, it just has branching roots that grow into the root. While a dicotyledonous plant has a taproot system, that means it's long and it has shorter roots branching out, coming out from the main root. The stems of a monocotyledonous are hollow and soft, while a dicotyledonous is solid and thick. In a monocotyledonous plant, the leaves are narrow, they have parallel veins. The base of the leaves form from a sheet around the stem, and there's no petole. while the dicotyledonous have broad leaves and they have branching veins, and it attaches to the stem by a petiole. The flowering plots basically are in multiples of three, and in a dicot, they have multiples of four. Okay, now we're moving on to basically how flowers become plants. Now let's look at the process of pollination. Now the bees when the bees visit the flower, they look for the pollen. And on the flower, you get sticky substances that the bees, when they land on, this pollen lands onto their little paws, or even birds. And then when they fly away, they disperse these pollen grains onto the soil. And with germination, the warmth of the sun, the water, and air, you get new plants that form. So, this cycle of a plant is quite important for you to know. Now let's look at reproduction in an angiosperm. That's a flowering plant. And a typical flower, it is composed of several parts that are arranged, that is on a ring, that are the four holes. That is namely the silax, which is set up like a live green structure. Then you get the corolla, which is the petals, the angiosperm, which is a set of stamens, that is the anther and the filaments, and the gynoecium, which is a pistil, and that includes the stigma, the style, the ovary, and the ovules. Now you can pause this video and you can go back to the flower, the structure of the flower video, and you must learn to identify these parts and where they are situated. For fertilization to occur, the male cells are found on the pollen grain and they fuse with the female sex cells, which is the ovum, which is found in the ovule. After fertilization, the ovule develops into seeds and the ovary into a fruit. Now, let's look at pollination. Pollination is basically the transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of a flower of the same species. Pollination is an important process that leads to fertilization. Pollen grains are carried from one plant to another by pollinators. Now, pollinators include insects, birds, small mammals, wind, and even water. For example, insects often visit plants in search of nectar, that is a sugary liquid. The pollen grains stick to the insect, and when the insect visits another flower of the same species, the pollen grains stick to that stigma. This is an example of pollinators, which is a bee, and they act as a pollinating agent. Okay, there's different types of pollination. You get self-pollination, where the flower or the pollen grains is transferred from the anther of a stigma to of the same flower. Then we get cross-pollination. That is when the pollen grains are transferred from the anther of one flower to the stigma of another of the same species. Okay, now let's look at insects and bird pollinators. Now, insects and bird pollinators are normally bright colored and they're attracted to the sweet smell of the flowers. The bright colors attract the insects and the birds to the flower's sweet nectar, and these birds and insects feed on it. When the insects and birds visit the flower, the pollen grains stick to their body, and this stigma is sticky, so when it touches them, they transfer it to another plant. Then we get wind pollinators. Wind pollinators basically produce large amounts of pollen, and this increases the chance of the pollen, and it will land on the stigma of the same plant to another. The pollen grains are small, light, and dry, and they allow the wind to carry them easily. These flowers do not have bright colors or nectar. They just basically move to another plant by wind. The stamen, which has the anther and the filament, basically hang outside of the flower for the wind to blow them away. And the flowers usually have large, long stigmas to increase the chance of pollination. Right, now if we look at the picture before we look at the notes, pollinators are very important to produce food for people. That is why farmers normally have um, bee pollination. Now, this is because and also they make honey. So this is important because these pollinators increase their production of their crops. If pollination does not occur, there will be less food available. So the farmers normally have these bee pollinators in their farm and they have beehives so they can enhance the production of food. Okay, now it becomes a problem when the pollinators decrease over the years. And this is because there's a loss of habitat. Maybe farms are cleared to build roads, or you get pesticides, and pesticides are poisonous and they lead to disease, so the pollinators decrease. To solve these problems, the farmers keep beehives near their crops, and this helps the pollen to pollinate the plants, and it is called pollination management. Right, fertilization occurs when the pollen grains land on the stigma. So the pollen grains go down the ovary, they go down the tube into the ovum, and this is where we say fertilization occurs. They form a new cell called the zygote, and they develop into an embryo. The other male cells join the female cells to form the endosperm. The endosperm is where they store food for the developing seed. Now, as the seeds develop, the ovary grows bigger and it becomes a fruit. The seeds are found inside the fruit, and this fruit protects the seed. The part of the flower that is no longer needed, such as the petals, setals, and stamens, basically dry off and they fall off. Now, this part here is what I explained in the previous diagram, except that there's a picture and just point forms for you to understand. It's a flow diagram of fertilization. It could be asked in term 1 or it could be asked in your term 2 exam. Okay. Now, seed dispersal is basically what we discussed earlier. Dispersal means moving seeds or fruit away from the parent plant. The seeds need to move far away so that they do not compete with the parent plant for water, sunlight, and soil nutrients. And we discussed how they were dispersed. They dispersed either by animals, wind, water, or the plant itself. Remember that seed dispersal helps new plants to grow far away to ensure their survival. Right, germination basically occurs when seed starts to grow into a new plant. And for that to happen, you need water, warmth, air, light for photosynthesis, and nutrients. Dormant cells basically stay asleep, and under the right conditions, then only will they grow. Now, this basically is everything that we discussed, but in a simplified version. You can pause the video and later go on to it, and you will learn how the plants germinate. Hope you liked the video. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and revisit the video basically in term 1 and term 2 so you can do well in your exam. Bye, everyone.